thanks for coming. Thanks for everyone online. I hope you can hear. I'm Karen Parry, the Oxford Energy Network Coordinator, and I'm standing in for Tina because she's not able to be here, but she is online. Before I introduce Hannah, just a quick word about next week's seminar, which is David Hoey from Engineering Science, who'll be talking about his experience of installing a 4 kilowatt pack solar array and a 10 kilowatt hour battery system in his house in 2023. So Hannah is a postdoctoral researcher whose work at the TSU focuses on the transition to electric mobility in the UK, using both qualitative and quantitative methods. She's leading this SEMITAS project, investigating how shared electric mobility services and infrastructure can be embedded in rural communities. She also works with the ECI researching household energy use. Hannah's worked as a transport planner in the UK, first for Arup and then Reading Borough Council. And just some academic background, completed her PhD at the University of Birmingham, where she worked on travel choices and the flexibility of work and travel. She also holds a BA in Urban Studies from Columbia University and an MSc in City and Regional Planning from Cardiff University.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction. I'm sorry you got lumped with the job.
No worries.
So, yeah, the brief for this talk was the future of energy for transport. So,
oh, is it working?
Moving ahead. There we go. So the short answer is the future of energy for transport is electricity, certainly for overland transport. And I'll come back to that image of Redbridge Park and Ride a little bit later on. The other energy for transport or overland transport is food. I say that because there are far more trips or legs of trips on foot, even in countries like the UK, that we tend to forget about because they're short distance. And in my opinion, I don't foresee a WALL-E type future where we all stop using our muscles to move around. But there's other people that have more expertise on food and walking than I do. So going back to electricity and transport electrification, we were asked to consider whether the present and whether this kind of, whether we would have envisaged this current future 25 years ago, would we have imagined it? And so I'll briefly touch on that in this presentation. Then I'll go into some evidence for why I'm saying that the future of transport is electricity for energy, that the transition to electric transport is accelerating, and that what we should be asking is not so much whether the transition is to electrification, but what that actually means in terms of what modes of electrically powered transport are available in which geographies and for whose use. I will also describe how I've approached this question in my research and become ever more convinced that the transition to electric mobility should not be considered in isolation from the transition to renewables and electrifications of other energy services. Both transitions are happening in different ways, in different geographies and at different scales, as aspects of my research will highlight, with implications, and this is one of the things that I've been particularly interested in throughout my time here at Oxford, of how fair and inclusive and just those transitions to electrification will be. Finally, at the end, I'll kind of go back to this seminar series other question, which is 25 years from now, where do I see this area of research and practice? So 25 years ago was about the time that I moved to the UK to do an MSc in City and Regional Planning at Cardiff, as Karen mentioned. And I would say that at the time I didn't actually imagine that I'd still be here 25 years later, never mind imagining the accelerating transition to electric transport. I would say that also I wasn't alone in not foreseeing electrification. Although EV technology has been around since the 19th century, and there's a lovely brief history that the Energy Saving Trust has, complete with a kind of etching illustration of one of the 19th century electric vehicles. The modern battery technology was only commercialized in the 1990s, and I think that particularly when I started getting involved in the transport sphere, there was a lot of skepticism about how much was hype and what technologies would actually take off. I would say that also as a transport planner, I was trained as a transport planner and a social scientist, not an engineer. We spent a lot more time studying what you might call avoid and shift measures rather than improve measures. So, for example, kind of concepts of bringing land use and transport planning together, walkable cities, 15-minute cities as it is much more commonly called now, reversing the decline of public transport and cycling. So, no, I didn't imagine it 25 years ago. And I would say that even, say, a dozen years ago, when the UK government first launched its Go Ultra Low City scheme, of which Oxford was one of the participants, I think there was a lot of uncertainty about which of the low carbon fuels, what energy source would actually scale. Because you need to remember that there's not just electric, there's also hydrogen, natural gas was being used in some places as a transition fuel, and this idea that it would be that it was much more efficient and environmentally friendly than petrol and diesel, biofuels as well. And I would add that I've even, in the last few years when I've been working on these projects and things like that, I still get asked, oh, well, wait a second, isn't hydrogen the future or something like that? To which I tend to answer no. I would also say that you can really see in the literature how, say, a dozen years ago or so, it was sort of hedging its bets, and then it becomes more certain as you go on. One of the quite what happened to the text snips, but yeah, one of the seminal pieces on multi-level perspective, which some of us use in transition studies. Frank Giels wrote in 2012, for example, that green propulsion had more potential than behavior change or demand management, so kind of avoid measures to drive the low carbon transition. But he wasn't at all specific at that time. And as I say, this was 2012, that the energy source would be electric. By 2017, he started to be a little bit more certain, saying that EVs were gaining momentum. And I would say that recent studies since 2020 go much further again. And yes, there's doubters and setbacks. Yes, there's unanswered questions still about raw materials and recycling. The scale of adoption in terms of millions of cars sold, though, millions of electric cars sold, continues to accelerate, particularly in China and Europe. This graph is from the International Energy Agency's 2025 report. The 2026 report has just come out, but it doesn't go back as far in time, so I didn't include it here. But yeah, it continues to accelerate, particularly in China and Europe, but also in the rest of the world. And if you do look at the 2026 report, despite stagnation of EV sales in the United States, the transition is continuing apace elsewhere, and interestingly, including lower and middle income countries, as transport electrification has become national policy, often with a focus on not only emissions reduction, but also bolstering industry and economic growth. And I would say that if you're trying to kind of put a finger on what was that moment in time where it felt like it was taking off, I tend to think that this is not a bad one. So this was the declaration on transport from COP26, which was held in Glasgow in 2021. And although it only refers to cars and vans, not 2- and 3-wheelers, which is what's taking off in a lot of African and Asian countries, lorries, buses, etc., it attracted signatories from around the world, national governments, more local governments, private sector as well, and nonprofits. So it's one way to look at that transition. So I don't know if anyone in the audience here or online has worked or knows Priya Bhagavati, who was in the Energy and Power Group over in engineering. She's now up at Strathclyde. We worked together on the Park and Charge Oxfordshire project, which was funded by Innovate UK. It was my first postdoc here at Oxford, and she created these graphs for the UK nations and also by county. So if you go follow the link, you can actually look county by county. And we revised them. She originally created them in 2019, and we revisited them and kind of wrote a blog about it in 2024. And they use an S-curve equation for technology diffusion, which is this idea of kind of early adopters that follow here, and then they're followed by the kind of early and late mainstream, and then laggards at the top. And it uses historic data only to project forward. So what that means is that the dotted lines, which are 2019, are extrapolated from data on battery electric vehicle registrations through 2019, and then the solid lines are through the additional data points that have been added. So they still have the ones up to 2019, but they've added data points up to the end of 2023. And you can kind of see how the way the formula works drags everything to the left as the transition accelerates. And I'm sure that if we added more recent data, it would change again. However, I think it's also important to note that despite acceleration here in the UK, uptake is also uneven. And you can see that at the level of the kind of home nations of Wales, Scotland, and England. Wales, although not as far behind as it was in 2019, is still quite a ways behind England and Scotland. You can see even more if you look at the more granular level. And it's also something that I've been looking a lot at in my research, is how uneven the rollout of charging infrastructure is as well. And that's important because a lack of access to charging is one of the main barriers to EV adoption, particularly for the approximately third of British households who are unlikely to be able to charge from home, but also because public charging is important to build confidence in drivers that they will be able to use a battery electric vehicle on the strategic road network when making longer journeys. I think charging is also particularly important to this audience because it's where the mobility transition overlaps with the energy transition. That includes both public and private charging, but I'll start with public charging as that's where my research started. This map is from ZapMap. They're a sort of application that you can have on your phone, you can have in your car to actually find charging as you're going about the country. And they're also contracted by the Department for Transport to track the rollout of public charging across the country. And more recently, they're also apparently giving regular updates to the Department for Transport on the reliability and performance of what's available. Their data is also being made available by the SENSE project, if anyone's heard of that the Energy Systems Catapult is running. But it's important to realize that equity and inclusion is about more than just spatial accessibility to charging. There's things like affordability, which is not only to be able to buy an EV, but also how affordable it is to charge it. We know that it's also obviously a lot more expensive to charge it on the public charging network than from home. Rapid charging is more expensive than sort of slower charging, or sort of 7 to 22 or 7 to 50 kilowatt, rapid being sort of above 50 kilowatt charging points. But all the different networks and charge point operators have different prices, and there's actually quite limited data to understand geographically where things cost more and where things don't. The other thing that kind of goes into how easy it is for people to use public charging when they feel it's available to them is whether it's providing for their needs and what they want. Now, that might be something like physical needs, but it's also kind of how they perceive the charging, its ease of use, whether they feel they have the skills to use it, and things like that. And some of that is what we were doing through the Park and Charge Oxfordshire project, which I mentioned earlier. We did those graphs, but the project itself was led by a local charge point operator who was tasked with installing charging hubs in council car parks around Oxford, not in Oxford City, but in the towns and villages around the other 4 districts of Oxfordshire. And our part of the project was to evaluate whether this business model would meet the charging needs of residents who would not be able to charge at home. So that was kind of the target group, that people generally who didn't have a driveway or garage and would be unlikely to be able to plug in at home, whether with a home charger or just into a 3-pin plug. So we were really trying to find out what a group needed that hadn't already adopted an EV. These were not early adopters. And one of the ways we did this is we did a large representative national survey that included a stated choice experiment. We ran a binary logic model to test that there had been no dominant alternatives and calculate willingness to pay. And that showed that there was a lot of value placed on the local environment where the public charging was situated. What was particularly interesting was that then when we ran a latent class model to understand more detail about who was wanting or who was placing so much value on some of these characteristics, like the local environment, we found that there was one cluster of participants that value the walk to or from public charging to their home, because remember, this is for people who can't charge at home. And they valued it being safe and pleasant so much that if they felt that it wasn't, so if like the choice we were giving them said, it's not so nice, they wouldn't want to use public charging at all. It was almost non-negotiable. So I think that it was quite interesting that it was not only about if the station was secure, but also the environment around it. And that particular cluster also tended to be more female. So in terms of our wider project and the charging hubs, there was also indications that charging hubs in neighborhood car parks were considered safer. And often it kind of makes sense because they're often located in more central, better lit areas. And this could be a better solution for some of the groups of future EV drivers than on-street charging. For the other 2 groups, it was notable that their prior kind of parking experience or their current parking situation, whether they already paid for parking, say if they were lived in a residence parking zone, or whether they said that they experienced a lot of parking congestion where they live and were kind of sort of fighting with their neighbors a bit over trying to park, really influenced how sensitive they were to the price of the public charging and the trade-offs they were willing to make for certainty over whether they'd be able to charge in that space and convenience. And the latter was associated, convenience that is, with on-street charging solutions, which tend to be attractive based on the assumption that households can continue to park where they already are and just charge at the same location. However, there are issues with such solutions, and there's a lot of debate around this with our partners in Oxfordshire County Council, because they can limit other people's use to that public space. They can create new parking pressures and congestion. It can add street clutter, and it potentially creates conflict between road users. So also, in a more practical energy system sense, charging hubs can operate off a single grid connection and can be more straightforward to implement. And I think that one thing that we found that was quite interesting in talking with other stakeholders, like the office, so the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles that gives funding to local authorities for installing public charging, is that despite the fact that the funding that was in place up until March last year was called On-Street Residential Charge Point Scheme, actually a huge proportion of it went to installing charge points in local authority car parks, just because it was practically more deliverable. The other thing about public charging hubs is that they create opportunities for sharing vehicles as well as sharing the charging facilities. I supported Oxfordshire County Council in a pilot that placed car club vehicles at about half the park and charge locations, hubs in 2023. And today there's still car clubs operational in about 8 towns and villages around Oxfordshire. So clearly there was some demand. And I think that it got me really interested in this idea of sharing not just the charging, but also the vehicles themselves, because it's a lot more efficient. It will help us get more towards our climate targets, because switching to EVs alone, if we're not also reducing car use and car ownership, is not sufficient. And it's quite interesting in energy terms, because there's already a lot of the charging hubs already use kind of load balancing technologies. The vehicles, the car club vehicles, the shared vehicles give kind of built-in market for utilization, as private adoption might be slower to build up in some of those locations. And it's also more future-proofed. And data from the pilot suggested that the car club vehicles actually purchased about 12% of the electricity from some of the hubs. So they were kind of the main customer at some of the hubs. And the graphs just show that the daily profile of electricity use of the private cars using those hubs and the car club vehicles wasn't the same, suggesting it could be quite complementary. Also, once a grid connection is established, the hubs and indeed the shared vehicles can be expanded to meet demand, enable bidirectional charging, be linked to other energy generation and storage, or even act as a depot for if we end up with having autonomous or driverless cars going around. It's much better that they're shared and that they're somewhere located. And this is not, again, like going back to kind of our idea of what is the future of transport. This is not all in the future. This picture I took in Utrecht, where they're already linking shared EVs and shared energy. So some Dutch cities have a policy of shared mobility to specifically address concerns that EVs aren't accessible to everyone, and that having a shared one spreads costs and mitigates spatial constraints on charging. And as part of a later project that I was on between 2021 and 2024 called ITEM, Inclusive Transitions to Electric Mobility. We talked to a lot of local policymakers and other stakeholders in 4 case study cities across Europe, including Utrecht, and talking about their EV sharing scheme. These EVs are operated by a company called We Drive Solar, which specifically installs bidirectional charging and integrates using those EV batteries to balance the grid and use more renewable energy production. So hitting a few birds with one stone. Now just to go on to the other type of public charging, because it's not all local resident targeted. You have a lot of rapid public charging being put in place on the strategic road network. This is from some work that a colleague did, Labib, if you've met him. He's also in the energy group. And he used surveys as well as more in-depth interviews at 3 large rapid public charging hubs, one outside London, one in Banbury, and the Redbridge Park and Ride that I showed on my earlier slide. And again, he was keen to understand not just access to this charging, but what EV drivers want from the charging, what they expect from it. And so he actually was looking at not just what their experiences of those charging hubs were, but also how those experiences fit into what they had expected and how they differed by those different locations. And he found that many users at these sorts of hubs were wealthier. They were often men. They were often on longer journeys and normally charged at home. So this was not their day-to-day charging. And I think one of the more interesting findings was that they were really willing to pay a premium if they were being given a premium charging service and also experience, so accompanying facilities and things like that. I think the other thing that I just wanted to kind of mention is that at Redbridge, it's not just about having a rapid charging hub. It was part of the Energy Superhub Oxford project, which some others worked on in the past from the energy team. And it also has solar production. It has battery storage connected to the grid. It has EV depot facilities for public service vehicles and a lot more. And I'm sure other colleagues at another time can answer more questions about it. But it's just to say that it's important not to forget that EVs are not just cars or private cars and vans or even shared cars. They do also include things like public service vehicles. They include buses and commercial vehicles of all sizes. I think that the UK is one of the biggest electric bus markets in Europe at the moment in terms of kind of purchase power. And charging for all these vehicles require a lot more energy. So definitely needs to be considered in terms of wider energy system management. There's all sorts of interesting things going on in this space technology-wise. But I think that in the hype or the focus on electric cars and vans, it can be forgotten. And I think one thing that was quite interesting, again, in the ITEM project, another of our partner cities was Poznan, which has had electric trams that never got taken up or moved, and they're also electrifying their buses. And yet some of their policymakers that were involved, participated in the project, didn't even think until prompted that that was electric mobility. So they were kind of like, wait a second, surely you're asking me about cars, private cars. You can't possibly be asking me about buses as well. Although there were other policymakers that were saying that that's not coming from them, it was coming from the national government because they had to lobby the national government to include rail-based vehicles in their Electric Mobility Act that included funding, because when the Polish law was written, it didn't actually allow for any of that funding to go toward electric vehicles that run on rails. So electric public transport, though, is really key, not just to decarbonisation targets, but also to including a lot more people in this transition. And again, kind of just all these different aspects. So there's micromobility. E-bikes are being adopted at a faster rate than EVs in various places across Europe. And I think e-scooters is a really interesting one because there's been some recognition that it might be able to displace much more polluting vehicles or complement public transport. And we did some analysis of Bristol's e-scooter service. Bristol was our British case study in the ITEM project. And it's the largest e-scooter scheme in Britain. And we found that it's not just in areas with high concentrations of young adults that they're particularly well used, but also in neighborhoods with concentrations of Black and Asian populations. And although e-scooters are yet to be legalized on public roads in the UK outside of approved trials, and indeed many policymakers didn't even have them on their radar, say 5 to 7 years ago. We looked at policy documents from Bristol that don't even mention e-scooters or an interest in them. And so it does make it difficult to incorporate them and integrate them into transport systems. And that's been quite reactive, not helped their image. But they can be really inclusive. And I think that it's also not helped by images like this one, which is from a road safety report on e-scooters. And it kind of gives the impression that all e-scooter riders are young hoodlums, which is antisocial, and that's not really helpful. But you know, it's got a lot of potential. I think that a lot of policymakers did recognize that in kind of in-depth discussion. Meanwhile, again, as I sort of mentioned toward the beginning, I'm not even going to talk about electric mopeds and other 2- or 3-wheelers, but those are increasingly popular in other countries, but not so much here in the UK or in Europe. Going back to EVs, and I now want to talk a little bit about the project I'm working on in the ECI, and zoom into the household level. This offers a different perspective of the integration between the energy and mobility transitions. So in the ITEM project, we learned that public EV charging infrastructure provision sometimes is dealt with by local energy teams and local energy policy. But we also know that the majority of EV charging is done domestically. And EDOL gives us an opportunity to look at that in a bit more detail, because it was set up to build on Searle, and Searle had almost 13,000 households across Great Britain. That I think there's 11,500 or so left, and collects half-hourly smart meter data on an ongoing basis. And although Searle had a baseline survey and 2 ad hoc surveys responding to COVID and the energy crisis, the EDOL project has been adding a lot more in-depth contextual data through a much more extensive survey and recruiting subsamples to agree to sensors to their homes and participate in more detailed data collection. But because of that smart meter deployment and sample retention, I should say that this sample is skewed towards homeowners, but that means that it's also skewed towards those who have adopted more low carbon technologies, including EVs. And so we had a sample of over 400 EV owners in our 2025 survey, and sure enough, they usually charge their vehicles at home, the vast majority of them, where it is both cheaper and more convenient. This means that it is not just the energy source that is changing from oil to electricity, but also the location of energy delivery that is changing from a petrol station to the domestic plug. EVs use much more electricity than any other domestic appliance. And if the household has a dedicated charger, it can use it much faster. So dedicated chargers could go up to 7 or 11 kilowatt hours. Obviously, EVs are charged when a vehicle is not in motion, which is interesting because it makes the timing of charging much more flexible than the use of other appliances to cook or clean. But you still plug them into your domestic electricity. So this graph represents the daily electricity use profiles of EV owning compared to non-EV owning households averaged from the smart meter data for the entirety of 2024. It's normalized by the number of people occupying the household. And I should note that we did also have it non-normalized, and we had it normalized by floor area. And this is a bit more extreme than those other 2 options. But you can see, so the no EV is the purple line. It's very different. And it's further complicated by the fact that a lot of the EV owners in the sample also co-adopt not just a home charger, but other low carbon technologies related to domestic energy demand, such as solar PV, batteries, time of use tariffs, which I include as a technology because it obviously gives them more incentive and also opportunity to flex their demand. And I segmented the EV owners, those 400 odd, by their configurations of technology co-adoption, as you can see in the pie chart. And then we looked at those daily net electricity import profiles again, but for each segment, again, controlled for occupancy. And you can see that those without any other tech and those with just a home charger, so we're looking at the dotted purple lines, have very similar profiles to the non-EV owners, which is the solid purple lines, except for that they consume more energy. I should note, by the way, that the EV owners who have no other tech, and that includes no home charger, only about half of them said that they usually charge at home using plugging into the mains. Meanwhile, the demand for the other groups, like the graph on the previous slide, peaks at 1 a.m. rather than about 6:30 p.m. And if they have solar PV or batteries, they show a dip in the middle of the day with two groups dipping below zero. That means they're exporting more energy than they're importing on average, if they have at least solar and or PV. And what was interesting is that we did a bit further analysis and found that that pattern was concentrated in the summer months, which is not surprising in the UK, but it's strong enough that it actually shows up in the annual averages as well. And it kind of raises new questions about how EVs are integrated into domestic practices and electricity use flexibility, as well as future vehicle to grid innovation and integration. I won't go into a lot more detail, but hopefully what I've described makes it clear that EVs are very important to the energy systems transition, from fossil fuel power to renewable and electrification of services like transport and heating. While co-adoption enables EV owners to maximize self-consumption and minimize bills for cost as much as for environmental reasons, these individual and household actions have the potential at the systems level to enable increased energy efficiency and flexibility that can counteract the intermittency of renewables, reduce the total energy that needs to be produced and transmitted, and makes demand management a really important area for research and an important tool for policymakers. It's why time of use tariffs, such as those included as a technology in the analysis I was just discussing, as well as demand management apps, have proliferated here in the UK. But there's still a lot of questions that we're looking to answer. How much will these tools reduce system-wide emissions and costs? Will there be compound or rebound effects? What practices will generate such effects, and how can different policies or the energy providers counteract them? For example, as EV adoption grows, unless price signals and demand management policies will adapt, the peaks at 1 a.m. will become unsustainable. And which organizations and apps will households trust to manage which of their energy services? People might not mind automating when their car is charging to match electricity supply, but they might be less willing to relinquish control of their heating, for example. Finally, if EVs and other low carbon technologies are saving users money, then they might spend it, obviously, on other high carbon consumption, the classic example being more flights and holidays. So this leads me into the final section of the presentation and the question about where I see things going in the future. As I just mentioned, there's plenty of unknowns and more research to do. And especially if we hope, or if as we hope, that our research will support how the transition is integrated into the wider transport and energy systems to deliver that kind of more equitable and inclusive future. I think particularly with the advent of things like automation and level 5 driverless vehicles and AI controlled systems, we don't want to just leave it to Elon Musk and Tesla to see where this transition is going. And I think that, again, going back to some of the points I made earlier, we need to make sure that the focus is not only on electrifying the private motor vehicle fleet. I think that it's made so many headlines that people have just kind of accepted that it's the quickest and easiest way to reduce transport emissions, and to an extent, I think that's true, but it's not enough on its own, as I say, to like-for-like replacement of private vehicles to meet climate targets, never mind deliver a socially just transition. Also, although the transition for private cars and vans is a pathway that many have bought into, arguably a lot of the measures that local policymakers are taking to support private vehicle electrification, things like trying to deliver an equitable distribution of charging points, or support particular user groups in purchasing an EV, it's just sort of tinkering around the edges rather than steering that transition. And it may be that in some situations that's because they're actually focused on policies that don't have to do with electrification, going back to the kind of avoiding and shifting travel to decarbonize. I think it was quite interesting that in the item project, I found many of the same attitudes amongst transport planners that as I was kind of taught about 25 years ago. You know, demand management, land use organization, public transport, walking and cycling, they are still of much greater interest to a lot of transport planners, and particularly urban mobility professionals, than supporting private vehicle electrification. What is less clear is what those policies can deliver and how they can be integrated into the transition to electric mobility. And also what happens outside urban areas where there are fewer alternatives to private vehicles. So that's my other current project, which I'm currently leading and focusing on electric car clubs in smaller towns and villages, like the pilot that I worked on in Oxfordshire, because I think that EV sharing has a lot more potential in these cities where public transport is often minimal or completely unavailable. And it also can support other policy goals around social inclusion and potential for social innovations and community action. And who knows, if things are happening in the countryside, they can also go the other way and inform the urban transition. So again, I'm just a couple of slides left to say a little bit more about that project. I'm applying social practice theory to look at not only the practice of using electric car clubs in various towns and villages that I'm working with across England, but also what policy practices are kind of enabling that use, and how the providers what are delivering the services, and how does that work, and how do they kind of interact and align and evolve. And I've got quite a lot of examples already of different ways that the communities where these car clubs are located are involved in kind of the provision and policy as well as the use, which I think is really important, because such services are not going to last, and they're not going to be scaled unless the community becomes involved and it becomes embedded. It becomes more of a normal thing, because they're much smaller markets, so they're not going to be financially viable if people come and go and try them here and there and don't get involved. I think that an interesting early finding is even where there's no local, even where the car club isn't necessarily community owned and there's no local car club staff, then you still find people sort of acting as local ambassadors, checking that the vehicles are properly plugged in, that they've been recently cleaned and things like that, and informing the operator if they haven't. So to get back to that question of what I would like to see in 25 years' time, I think that understanding how shared electric mobility can work in rural areas through social innovation might help guide research into socio-technical transitions that can realize a more transformative impact. I was kind of thinking with this diagram I found about Spray's seminal article from 2018 that proposes that the transition shouldn't be to shared electric or autonomous, it should be to all three at once, and that would be most disruptive and impactful. And I would add that to these three, that also if it's integrated with other low carbon energy innovations and energy systems, so that the availability of diverse context appropriate vehicle types and transformative social practices can drive that socially just transition. So that's kind of where I wanted to end. Thank you.